Settle down, students. Settle down. I know you're all excited to be here in College Football 101, the introductory lecture, going over the ancient origins of the game of football. But first, let me get a few things out of the way. Over the course of this lecture series, I will be using the term football to describe American gridiron-style football. And for the Europeans that are watching at home, I apologize for that. But really, it all comes down to a quirk of entomology. See, as a fan of American football, I have often been criticized saying, oh, football, your game's not football. You don't use your feet, and it's not really a ball. It's an egg, so it should be called hand egg instead of football. But if you look really at the etymology of the word football, it is not intending to describe the manner of the use of the foot in relation to the ball, but the fact that it is a game played with a ball while played on foot. And really, the argument derives from a problem of the broadness of the term football. Many different games can be considered to be football. Everything from your classics, American football, soccer, which is what I'll be calling it, association style football, or even rugby football can be easily considered football. Even still further, you can consider any game that is played on foot with a ball to be football. Baseball can be considered football under that etymological definition. Volleyball, basketball, all those games could be considered to be forms of football based off of this definition of the term football. So over the course of this lecture series, I will be using the words football to describe American football and soccer to be describing association football. I apologize in advance, but as an American, that is what feels natural to me. I grew up with those terms, and it's going to rub some folks the wrong way, most of Europe and really most of the other nations of the world. I severely apologize for that, but I want to, as we go through this, to kind of explain why I've decided to use those terms. But first, we really have to go back almost to the beginning of human history itself, because I would argue, and I choose to argue in this lecture, that the ball is probably the oldest form of toy that exists in a form that is currently recognizable today. See, the ball, you can get a ball from anywhere, whether you get a bundle of leaves together, or if you were one of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, the liver or the stomach or the bladder of a deer or whatever animal happened to be hunted today. Easily it could be blown up and turned into a ball. Something for the kids in the tribe to pass the time with, to teach them how to, have endurance and, fine motor control, hand-eye coordination, all stuff that was very useful to a hunter-gatherer society. And even as people moved into civilization as we know it today, as people moved away from the hunter-gatherer into the agrarian societies that we know in the ancient world, the Bronze Age civilizations, the ball stayed around. In fact, the oldest surviving ball that we know of today was dated to around 2500 BC. It was actually found in a tomb in Egypt. And we can also tell from the various histories that we've been able to derive of these ancient cultures that ball games, these football games, were played almost everywhere. The Mesoamerican ball game was a very big deal in Central America. I've not done as much studying on that, but it was a very old and ancient game. It's still played, or at least a version of it is still played in the modern day. Cuju was actually it is considered the earliest ancestor of association football, soccer. FIFA recognizes it as such. It was originally created in Han, China, around or in between 206 and 224 AD. 206 BC to 224 AD. Now, the game of Cuju was divided into two versions. There was a more competitive contact version, and there was a more respectful, genteel kind of take turns back and forth. But the main purpose of the game was that people would kick a ball, keep it up in the air, very similar to the soccer game of keepy uppy or hacky sack. And they would attempt to pass it to teammates and attempt to get it through a large centralized hoop to score points. Eventually, it would be spread to Japan, where it was known as Kamari. I apologize for any mispronunciations during the course of this lecture, but Kamari was a much more ceremonial, a lot less competitive version of Cuju. Again, focused mostly on just keeping the ball in the air. But as we were talking about football, gridiron football, the oldest ancestor that I can trace directly to gridiron football is the game of Epikouros, which was a very physical game that was played back in ancient Greece. And for Epikouros and its descendant Harpastum, we don't know 100% what the rules were. No surviving code of play has been found up to this point, but we know that Epikouros was a very violent game. It was actually a military training tool used by the Spartans during the rise in their heyday. Usually played between teams of 12 players. The field was divided into by the Skyros, the name meaning upon the Skyros. The center line was the Skyros, and there was two teams of 12, and behind the two teams of 12 were basically an end zone or an end line. And the goal of the game was that one team would take the ball and attempt to throw it over the heads of the other team, where the other team would pick it up. And the inevitable goal was to have the other team retrieve the ball behind their end line. See, this game of Epikouros was actually used a lot in ceremonial, feasts and things of that nature. It was a pastime, but it was also a military practice. It was a very team-oriented game, especially for the Spartans, who had these. They would basically be grown up in a group of 10 to 12 or however many people that they kind of were their battle buddies, to use a more modern parlance. This was a way for these boys to gain trust in each other and help learn that teamwork aspect. Just as the oldest ball games were invented to strengthen the players, Epikouros was done to strengthen the soldiers of Sparta and of the Greek city-states. And eventually this game would migrate over, as many different forms of entertainment and culture did, to ancient Rome, where it was known as Harpastum. And again, we know even less about Harpastum than we do Epikouros. In Epikouros, we kind of have a vague understanding of what the game was. And in Harpastum, the only thing we really know about it was a game where a ball was passed back and forth between teams, and it was quite violent. There is a more medieval version of Italian football, whose name escapes me at the minute, but we do know the rules of that. And it's very similar to this mob football that we're going to talk about here in a second. But we know that the Italian medieval football was a very violent game. So if we assume that this Harpastum was a direct ancestor to this Italian street football, we know that this game was a very violent game, just like Epikouros and just like medieval mob football. See, medieval mob football is probably the most interesting form of football that has ever existed. Mostly we're going to be centering on England. Again, England is the direct descendant, or is the land where the official rules for both rugby style and association football were created. We're going to focus mostly on the English and the evolution of their game. not to say that these mob style games are not played throughout Europe, but the culture of mob football in England was very interesting. See, mob football in England was never uniform. There was not a strict set of codes for how mob football was played. And you see, I use the word mob because this medieval football could be played from anywhere between 10 players, with two sides of the street, to hundreds, if not thousands, of players on both teams. You see some modern versions of this medieval football, Shrove type football up in England is still played, at least in one town whose name escapes me at the minute. But the rules were not uniform, and so there was a lot of variation. The main rules were that we had to move a ball. There was a ball that was centrally located, and both teams had to force the ball by hook or by crook, basically, to a different goal, whether it be the balcony of a church, across a fence line, over a river, whatever the goal was. They had to move the ball by any means necessary across a relatively large portion of field. And really, the only other main rule that was included was don't kill your opponent. Anything up to the point of maiming or killing somebody was allowed. We know a little bit about this, that this medieval football was played in England for a very long time. The oldest English reference to the game of football comes from the 8th century English historian Bede in his book De Temporum Rationum, Ratione. Again, I apologize for the poor pronunciations, but he described it as playing ball in that game. That was the early English history. In 1303, the oldest surviving reference of university football was written. It says that, and this is the quote, Thomas of Salisbury, a student at Oxford, found his brother Adam dead, and it was alleged that he was killed by Irish students whilst playing the ball in the high street towards Eastgate. Again, number one rule was don't kill each other, but unfortunately, it continued to happen. Over this medieval period, there was almost 30 or more attempts to ban this mob football in England. Most of the time, it was because the English nobility, especially the king, wanted their soldiers to spend time, or wanted their people to spend time doing useful things and mostly practicing their archer arts. It takes a long time for an archer to become a skilled archer. And the backbone of the English military during the medieval time was their longbowmen, which takes even more time than just a standard archer or a crossbowman. So quite often there was attempts to ban this medieval mob football in England. Some notable examples: in 1314, King Edward II attempted to ban it. And not only did Edward II attempt to ban it, Edward III attempted to ban it in 1349, and Edward IV also attempted to ban it in 1477. King Richard the Lionheart, Richard II, attempted to ban it in 1389. Henry IV attempted to ban it in 1401. And Henry VIII, even all the way up to Henry VIII, in 1540 attempted to ban football. This was the most hypocritical of them all, because Henry IV was actually the first person in history to have a custom pair of boots specifically designed for playing football. Really, every 20-ish years or so, the English monarchy would attempt to ban this mob football in some way or another. And as you can understand from the fact that these games or attempts were continued to be made at banning them, obviously didn't work. People kept playing football games. Actually, in a surprising turn of events, King James I actually promoted football in 1618 as a kind of anti-puritanical stance. Let's see, the Puritans, who were a major political force at that time. This is again around or just prior, I guess, to the English Civil War. The Puritans were a major political force in England at this time, and they didn't enjoy games. And so James the First, a more Catholic leaning of the royalty, House of England, I guess, he actually promoted the game of football to be played after church on Sundays, attempting to, I guess, dissuade people from kind of joining into this, whatchamacallit, this puritanical streak. And really, the only time, or the final version, the final band that fully stuck for this medieval mob style football was the Highways Act of 1835, which banned the playing of football along highways in England. Again, highways being a long stretch of kind of open space that you could play a game of mob football that would take place potentially over or between two cities even. So this finally kind of ended medieval mob style football in England. Again, there are some places that in England, a couple of places that still play it based off of tradition, but it's nowhere near as popular as it once was. But that is also because of the rise of more formal rules of more modern styles of football. See, in England around that same time in the 17th century, there was the rise of what now the British call public schools, what we Americans would more call private schools. They were places like Eton, Rugby, Shrewsbury, Westminster, Winchester, all the other ones. There was many different Canterbury. There was many different private schools that were created for these minor nobility. And again, the nouveau riche that we talked about in our last lecture on the origins of the theme park. See, there had to be a place for these kids to go and learn. Now, originally, these were intended to be Latin grammar schools, and they eventually kind of moved into a more formalized boarding school type place for young men to be gathered and learn reading, writing, arithmetics, whatever science there was at the time, all that sort of stuff. And wherever young men gather, wherever kids gather in general, games are invented. Every kid has invented a game of some kind in their lives. And in these public schools, various different forms of football were created. It couldn't be the same medieval style football because these kids were all intended to be, living on the campuses of these schools. But nevertheless, the games were created. And broadly, they were kind of divided into two main categories. There were games that focused on the kicking of the ball. Places like Eton, Westminster, and Winchester focused entirely, or more often than not, on the kicking of the ball, versus schools that focused on the handling of the ball, like Rugby and Shrewsbury. And for the discussion today, we're going to focus on the Rugby school. See, Rugby is famous for the invention of rugby-style football. And there is one main person that is attributed to have invented rugby-style football, and his name was William Webb Ellis. This was a story that was first told in 1876 by a man named Matthew Bloxam. And he said, Matthew Bloxam said that before 1823, that whenever the game was played, if somebody were to catch the ball on the fly, somebody kicked the ball and the ball was caught, the player who caught the ball was supposed to put it down on the ground and kick it along. But according to Bloxam, that there was a student there at the rugby school. His name was William Webb Ellis, who would eventually go on to believe he served in Parliament later on. I know he didn't serve in Parliament. He ended up becoming clergy in the English church. Very well respected clergy member. But he caught the ball during this game in 1823, and instead of placing it on the ground and kicking it forward to his teammates, he ran with it, thus inventing the concept of running with the football, which would eventually evolve into rugby-style football as we know it today. And that is generally like the rugby union and rugby league will go and point to William Webb Ellis. The rugby school itself points to William Webb Ellis as the inventor of rugby style football. But this might not be the case because in 1895, there was a investigation going into, or investigation put on by basically the alumni of the rugby school to determine the origin point of rugby football. See, the story that Matthew Bloxham reported first came out in print in 1876. William Webb Ellis died in 1872, 4 years before the story was invented. So William Webb Ellis was not around to say whether or not he was the inventor of rugby-style football. So in 1895, the alumni group gets together and they decide to look into the history. Now this is where a man named Thomas Hughes comes in. Thomas Hughes was a famous author of the time period. He wrote a book, or a series of books called Tom Brown's School Days that were heavily inspired by his time as a child at the rugby school. See, Hughes was at the rugby school between 1834 and 1842. So a good decade or so after William Webb Ellis supposedly invented carrying the football. But Thomas Hughes, in his recollection of his time at the rugby school, said that, especially in his first year, if any kids were seen carrying the football, that they would basically have been beaten up, that they were considered to be cheats and would have been severely beaten, as kids are off to do. But he did go on to say that another player by the name of Jem Mackey was the, quote, first great runner in between 1838 and 1839 while he was there at the rugby school. And unfortunately, Jem Mackey ended up being expelled from the rugby school in 1842. He may have been the one that ended up in Congress. I'm not 100% sure what happened to Mackey after that point. But this leads to an interesting thought. Did the rugby school throw the memory of Jem Mackey under the bus because of his, obvious he had to have done something bad or was a troublemaker of some kind so that he was expelled from the school? Would the creators or the leadership of the rugby school want to point to the virtuous William Webb Ellis, again, a priest or even a bishop, I believe, in the Anglican Church, versus a student that was expelled as their grand origin point for the creation of their rugby-style football? If you're a fan of baseball or if you've watched the Ken Burns baseball documentary, this may sound familiar, where the, I believe it was the American League owners, launched an investigation into the creation of baseball, and they determined that Abner Doubleday, a famous Civil War general, a hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, was the quote-unquote person who invented baseball, when really it was a collective effort of the New York Knickerbockers Club, and in the 1840s, well, after whenever Abner Doubleday was supposed to have invented it. But they pinned it on Doubleday because, he's a hero. Of course he was the one who created football. Or baseball, excuse me. When really it was, again, it was New Yorkers. It was just general, common folk instead of some heroes. But either way, however you want to put it, whoever invented carrying the football. Eventually, in 1845, the folks of the rugby school eventually put down their rules of football on paper, and this becomes the first officially recognized set of rules for football as we know it. Again, a game that is played on feet, carrying or using a ball. The first official set of rules were these rugby rules in 1845. Now, there is a problem with this. There are still schools like Eton, Westminster, Winchester, who want to play a more focused game on kicking, especially these Eton folks. They really care a lot about kicking the ball, and they believe that handling the ball does not make a good game. There are whatchamacallit. Yeah, so and really the difference between the two comes down to two things. One, obviously, is the carrying of the ball. Some of these schools prefer not carrying the ball and having to kick it the whole time. But really it takes up until a much later date where you're not allowed to even touch it. A lot of these kicking schools were more like that, supposedly the original rugby style, which was you catch the ball, you place it down on the ground, and then kick it on. Or, I guess the second argument between these schools was hacking. Now, hacking is a very interesting name, but really it means tackling in some form. Specifically using the kicking of somebody's shins in order to stop them when they are approaching or like carrying or dribbling the ball up the field. Especially as all these kids grew up and they were playing these games and they went out into their social lives as adults, eventually they started creating clubs to play their sports, and there was many different attempts at compromise between the handling crowd and the kicking crowd. In 1846, at Cambridge, many senior level students, very upperclassmen students, came together to discuss a compromise between the hacking handling rules and the non-hacking kicking rules. Unfortunately, nothing really came of this. And there was much public debate over this whole time in magazines, newspapers, just amongst people about which rules are better than others. You would have people say, people from Eton or Cambridge be like, oh, anybody who handles the ball is a brute and charlatan or whatever. Basically, they just go back and forth because everybody's arguing, just like how we do nowadays, about which version is better. Is American football better versus association football, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody had their dog in the fight. And so, but at this point, there was no separation between the rules. It was a very gray area. Every time that you played a game, you kind of had to clarify what rules you were playing under, especially because a lot of these rules, a lot of people didn't know the entirety of these rules. Actually, in 1861, all the various different rules were published in one of the many football magazines so that people could understand and figure out what in the world each of these separate rules meant and what each place was playing under. It helped people understand the breadth of football rules and help them understand which ones they may like or may not like. And so this guy, J.C. Tring, I believe he was the headmaster of one of these many public schools. In 1862, he created a simplified version of football. I believe 11 rules. That was supposed to be the most generic, like everybody will be happy with these rules. Didn't really touch on hacking or any of that stuff. And while he did create these rules, unfortunately, they weren't very popular because it was a compromise to everybody, and nobody likes compromise. So, in 1863, there was a group of anti-hacking clubs. There's a group of these football teams or football clubs that came together in London, and these were all teams that agreed on the anti-handling, anti-hacking style of play, and they would create the Football Association, whose name is derived, or from whose name we derive association style football. which would evolve into soccer as we know it today. See, soccer comes from association. They shortened it to a sock, and in the style of the time, they added an ER at the end as a little playful thing. So it was originally a soccer, and eventually that was shortened down to soccer. Eventually soccer, football, just soccer. And that was a term that actually was primarily used in England all the way up till World War II, when the Americans came over and were using the term soccer. And I guess as a, like, oh, there's crude Americans over here calling it soccer, because actually, the main thing was, soccer was the word of the people. The majority of people in England who played soccer called it soccer. The folks who called it football were the people who played non-football games on horseback, polo, horse racing, etc. The upper class. The upper class called it football, while the lower class and middle class called it soccer, until the Americans came over to England during the Second World War, at which point the British as a whole thought, oh, our crass American cousins, they decide to call it soccer, well, we shall call it football. And that's where the football term for soccer eventually takes over in Europe and kind of eventually spreads all over the world. So when we use the term soccer, why Americans use the term soccer is because we've always used the term soccer to, to describe this game. So really, if you want to consider, we are using the original term for the game versus, as a generalized football, mostly, and again, because by the 1940s, 1950s, while there was some rugby football teams, soccer was the game in Europe, in Europe as a whole, and in Britain particularly. And so they could go back and call it football because it was their version of football. It was the most popular version of football, was the association style, soccer style rules. But by the 40s, America had developed their own football that was their national football game. And so that's why our football is different than European football. And that's why we continue to use the older term soccer, or the, the original term of soccer, for association style football. And that's why I continue to use it today. But obviously, with the creation of the Football Association and their official designation of the rules of football to be played under the non-hacking, non-handling version, there are a lot of teams in England, especially a lot of teams that had association with the rugby school in their game, that felt left out because they did not have their own association to, say, oh, well, here's the rules if you're playing with hacking and with carrying the ball. And so in 1871, the Rugby Football Union is established, where it writes down their version of the rules, and eventually, it goes on from there. But throughout all of this, the English Empire is on the move. And eventually, they're sending folks over here to America. And in America, just like in, in Canterbury and all this stuff, and Eton, all their public schools, the Americans begin to establish their own institutes of higher education. Places like Harvard in 1636, Yale in 1701, Penn in 1755, William and Mary in 1793, Columbia in 1754, Princeton in 1746, Brown in 1764, and Rutgers in 1766. See, the Americans, naturally wanted to create their own, higher educational universities and schools. And just like with England, wherever young men and women, or mostly men in these cases at the time, whenever they would gather, they created their own versions of football or their own versions of sports. Princeton had their own game called Ballown, Ballown, that was played or it was invented around the 1820s. Um, and they even played intramural tournaments of this at the time. Harvard had a tradition called Bloody Monday, which was a game of football between the freshman and sophomore classes. It was played, or first played in 1827, and it was so violent, kind of more along the lines of this mob style football. It was so violent that they banned it outright in 1860. Um, and we can even say that there was earlier versions of what would become Bloody Monday, going back to 1741. Um, Dartmouth had what they called Old Division football, which was played between the 1830s through the 1890s, when modern American style football was created. It was a mob football game, and their attempt was they had two main fences. There was an east fence and a west fence, and the two teams would attempt to kick the ball over the east or west fence. And they developed teams based off of the houses that each of these students lived in. Again, kind of like in Epicurus, where it was determined by which group of Spartan soldiers you were in. A lot of these early football games in America were also determined on social associations, whether or not you were in the freshman class or the sophomore class, or if you were in Brown Hall, or if you were in whatever building. That's where your teams were developed. And so, and then Yale, and there was a guy named Charles Goodrich who was in the class of 1797, and he wrote that, quote, football, 2 words, was our common sport. We would begin in the middle line, and if the scholars were generally out on both sides, whenever the ball was driven over one of the outside lines, the party on that side was beaten. Very close to Epicurus again. But as the nation developed and as railroad lines were, put down and people were able to travel more, these intercollegiate rivalries started to develop. And I believe it was the 1820s when Harvard and Yale began having rowing competitions against each other, creating the oldest intercollegiate rivalry that still exists today. And 2 of these colleges that are located very close to each other are Princeton University and Rutgers University, University of New Jersey. I believe it was originally called Queens College. They were the 2 major universities in the state of New Jersey, very close distance to each other. And so in 1869, a game of football is proposed between the 2 universities. Eventually, they settle on playing 3 games between the 2 universities. And Princeton ends up sending some of their players down to Rutgers in November November 6, 1869, and a game of football is played. The NCAA, the governing body of college football, determines this to be the first college football game played in America. And I will go on and argue in our next lecture that I would not necessarily consider this to be the first football game. Obviously, it was the first intercollegiate game of football, using that etymological term of a game that was played on foot with a ball. But if you were determining this as American gridiron college football, you are very mistaken. See, in the Targum, which was the Rutgers University student paper, it described the game, the first game, as such. It says, at last we won the match. To sum up, Princeton had the most muscle, but didn't kick very well and wanted organization. They inevitably don't like to kick the ball on the ground. Our men, on the other hand, though comparatively weak, ran well and kicked well throughout, but their great point was their organization, for which great praise is due to the captain, Leggett, class of 72. The right men were always in the right place. After the match, the players had an amicable feed together, and at 8 o'clock our guests went home in good high spirits, but thirsting to beat us next time if they can. So what happened in this game was Rutgers, the home team in this case, they fielded a team of kind of short, fast people, while the team from Princeton ended up sending a whole bunch of really tall guys. And actually, the Princeton players wore red or scarlet handkerchiefs around their heads or on their bodies somewhere, and that gave them the name that they currently still go under, the Scarlet Knights. And so this Harvard or this Rutgers captain, again, his name was Leggett. Captain Leggett came out with a great plan. See, at the beginning of the game, there was a very physical advantage for the Princeton players. But this Captain Leggett realized that if they could keep it on the ground, especially at a time when you kick the ball up, and actually it goes a little bit later, because it says in the second match, the Rutgers paper basically says the whole reason they lost the second game was because it says, quote, the styles of playing differ materially in the two colleges. A fly or first bound catch entitles a free kick, a la Princeton. We bat with hands, feet, head, sideways, backwards, any way to get the ball along. So under Rutgers rules, it was they were an anti-handling school. They attempted to bat the ball forward, but you weren't allowed to carry it or run with it, versus Princeton, who played under the more older style rugby rules where you catch the ball, you place it on the ground, and kick it. And so the Rutgers players, or not the Rutgers, the Princeton players were used to this more physical style where they had to catch the ball and kick it. But they were unable to understand the Rutgers way of playing. And so, and again, to Captain Leggett's credit, he also commanded his players to kick the ball low, thereby eliminating a lot of the power or the height imbalance between the Rutgers and the Princeton team. And so Rutgers ended up really winning that first game handily. And as was said or mentioned briefly there, second game they go off to Princeton. They play under Princeton's rules about catching the ball, placing it on the ground, and kicking. Again, a much more physical style, and Rutgers gets beaten handily under the Princeton rules. They have a third game. I can't exactly remember what happened in that game, but this is considered the first American intercollegiate football game. And that is correct, but I would even argue that this is more contemporary with the first American intercollegiate soccer game. We will get into the developments of the American way of football in a later lecture as we describe the rise of football in the United States. But as you can see, football is a broad spectrum. Again, everything from Cuju, which is keepy uppy through a hoop, to Epikuros, a brutal battle between players, to the Mesoamerican ball game where you try to hit the ball through a hoop that's really much more like basketball, to this mob-style football where hundreds, if not thousands of players are attempting to move a ball, all the way to the Eaton. Eaton had a very interesting game. They called it the wall game, where it was like 100-yard long wall that was a separation. It was basically on the edge of like whatever they had as a sporting field, and they played their football game along this wall. There's pictures in this book here. It's a really great book. It's called The Lost Century of American Football. But it has pictures of this Eaton wall game. Let's see if I can find that real quick. I couldn't find it. But this Eaton wall game is literally, there's players pressed up against the wall trying to kick this ball out from, almost a scrimmage or a scrummage under the rugby style rules. Because again, the one thing common between a lot of these games was a kind of an inherent sense of violence. But there's so many games that can be described as a football game. And really, I guess to sum up this first lecture is that we really shouldn't be bothered about what games we call football. If you had gone to, you know, really, I guess one of the most inherent things about football in and of itself is the variety of ways that it can be played. It's been played so many different ways over so many different years that there really isn't one true style of football. Football is whatever you grew up playing or whatever you grew up watching. Again, for an American, our football is that gridiron style versus an Englishman who grew up with the association style football. But just because there are two different styles does not mean that one is football and one is not football. All the people who say, oh, your football should be called hand egg, do not understand the broad history of games that have been described football. Really, and they don't understand the fact that football itself is a very generic term. So I guess, students, I will leave you with that is next time you hear somebody talk about football, one, inquire what kind of football it is, and two, don't be upset at them for using whatever their term for football is. So I'll leave you with that. We will be back soon with our second lecture, which will describe the really the origins of the American Association gridiron style football, Walter Camp, all the way up to the invention of the forward pass. I hope that you will be back to see us when that happens. If you have any questions about this lecture, please put them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the video. They'll be up somewhere over here. It'll be the last video, which was about the history of theme parks, the origin of the theme park. Thank you so much for watching this lecture from Bensylvania University. Again, I am Professor Ben, and thank you for watching.